Hi, my name's Jen. Welcome to Week 10. To introduce this week's topic, I want to start with a quick recap of where we've come from. In Unit 1, we looked at the science of climate change and how this is interpreted by politics and the media. In Unit 2, we shifted to environmental impact assessment at both a project and strategic policy level. Now, in Unit 3, we'll put those two themes together. How can impact assessment inform policy to tackle climate change? This presentation will focus on three key areas. What climate change impact trajectory are we on? How should we respond to minimise the impacts of climate change? And what policy mechanisms can be utilised at both the global and national level to achieve the desired response? The IPCC Fifth Assessment highlights 4 projections they call representative concentration pathways. These show different concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere by 2100. Each one corresponds with how many degrees of warming we can expect above pre-industrial temperatures. RCP 2.6 is the one that corresponds with 2 degrees C. The do-nothing approach would land us somewhere between RCP 6 and RPC 8.5. The RPCs are derived from extensive data modelling combining projected population size, economic activity, lifestyle, energy use, land use patterns, technology and climate policy. Strategies to slow or reverse emission trends therefore need to address the trends in these underlying factors. However, policies to limit population growth and/or curb economic growth tend to be politically controversial. Therefore, policies have usually focused on promoting technological solutions. Technological solutions, though, require economic growth, and economic growth generally means increased consumption, often negating the technological advancements. A vicious cycle. 3 key themes coming out of the IPCC's future scenarios are that 1. Global economic growth will outpace emission-reducing technological innovations. 2. Developing countries' emissions will overtake those of presently industrialised countries within a few decades. And 3. Emissions are highly sensitive to trends in energy resources and technologies. So how do we respond? There are 2 main categories of response to climate change: mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation targets the cause of climate change, i.e. reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Adaptation focuses on adjusting to the change and hence reducing the resulting harms, for example, planting drought-resistant crops. But it is not a case of either or. Both mitigation and adaptation strategies are needed. But predicting how people will adapt to change is a huge uncertainty. Richer societies with well-functioning institutions and strong social networks are less vulnerable and have greater adaptive capacity, but that doesn't necessarily mean they'll use it well. While communities who are more vulnerable due to where or how they live may be limited in their adaptive capacity by their level of access to resources. So what is the role of government in facilitating adaptation? Well, firstly, by providing information and assistance, for example, climate projections, impact studies, assessments of potential responses, and technical and financial aid to implement responses. Secondly, through their regulatory authority to require citizens to reduce their vulnerability, for example, changing zoning codes. And thirdly, by investing in adaptive capacity directly, for example, building coastal defences and design requirements for infrastructure development. Further to this, however, due to the uncertainty surrounding climate change impacts, there is the need for government to facilitate an increase in general resilience, for example, strengthening the public health system, emergency response systems, and reducing poverty. As we have discussed in recent weeks, the role of government to enact policies to mitigate climate change at a strategic level is essential. So what policy mechanisms are available? Due to the global nature of climate change, and in the absence of a global government, policy at an international level can be a slow, cumbersome and weak process, and relies on action at a national policy level to meet international agreements. Let's look at 4 international mechanisms. The most well-known international mitigation policy measure is performance targets, such as the Kyoto Protocol. industrialised countries agreed to individual targets based on a certain percentage of their 1990 emission levels. For Australia, it was 108%, but most committed to a reduction. The 5-year commitment period ended in 2012 with mixed results. A second commitment period was adopted in Doha in 2012. To date, 18 countries have ratified, but Australia is not one of them. Such performance targets require flexibility for participating countries to choose how they achieve their targets, and also should have consequences for not meeting the target. However, if the consequence is too minor, there is little incentive to make an effort. If it's too major, countries will only agree to easy-to-achieve targets. The other main international mechanisms include negotiating the actual national policies at an international level instead of targets, international processes such as cap-and-trade system, and the creation of international institutions with delegated authority such as the EU or the World Trade Organization. At a national level, there are a wide range of mechanisms available. Market-based mechanisms include a carbon tax, a cap-and-trade emission permit system, or a hybrid of these two. Conventional regulations can be used to specify performance targets regarding emissions of a pollutant. Investment can be made in research and development for advanced energy technologies, and then there are voluntary measures, such as public disclosure of a company's greenhouse gas emissions. Countries around the world have adopted different mitigation policy mechanisms to varying degrees. In the US, it is largely left to the individual states. The EU have enacted an emissions trading scheme. China, through regulatory enforcement and incentives, is improving energy efficiency and expanding non-emitting sources of energy. And Bhutan is the only carbon neutral country in the world and has a constitutional commitment to retain 60% forest cover in perpetuity. It has also registered several of its hydropower projects under the UN's Clean Development Mechanism. Australia, meanwhile, has made a commitment to reduce emissions by 5% below 2000 levels by 2020, which has bipartisan support but disagreement over the mechanisms to achieve this. Labor introduced a carbon tax on big polluters, but the Liberals' approach is to pay big polluters from an emissions reduction fund to undertake emission reduction projects, part of what's been labelled the government's direct action plan. Another example is that Labor introduced the renewable energy target, that 20% of Australia's energy be from renewable sources by 2020, with financial incentives for the uptake of renewable energy at both household and industry level. The Liberals' review of this mechanism, released 2 months ago, recommends abolishing or at least phasing it out, arguing it is too costly. Such policy uncertainty is making it difficult for the private sector to make strategic business decisions. Ideally, mitigation and adaptation effort would proceed to the point where the costs balance out with the climate change damage. But the difficulty is in how to determine costs. Mitigation measures are relatively straightforward. Adaptation measures, however, are more difficult, as how do you put a price tag on the enjoyment derived from autumn leaves, for example? The British-based Stern Review in 2006 suggested the annual cost of stabilisation at 500 to 550 parts per million CO2 equivalent is estimated to average 1% of GDP by 2050. But there is a much higher price to delay. In conclusion, how do we know if the chosen policy mechanisms will set us on the desired IPCC pathway to not exceed 2 degrees of warming globally by 2100? In short, we don't. But we have to start somewhere, with a suite of policies that are then modified and scaled up as necessary over time. This chart highlights some of the complexity in the various trade-offs that have to be considered in responding to climate change. A series of climate change mitigation actions are listed from mitigation to adaptation and placed on a scale according to how positively or negatively they impact biodiversity. In this case, the win-win-win actions are forest conservation, urban tree planting, and green rooftops. But actions like wind turbines and biofuels, which may have a positive impact on reducing carbon emissions, can have a negative impact on biodiversity. I hope you have enjoyed this presentation, and I look forward to the discussion online.